Right. Okay, so let's resume. All right. So we were looking at the metaphors from before. Um, Basically, the idea is to get the metaphors to try and give a description of what the leadership definition would be about. And one that they took up here um, is the most contemporary version of the metaphor is the orchestra or symphony, and that actually is a leader in action. So this picture here is to kind of give you the idea of what they're talking about. But there's this image here that was also used. It's called the jazz musician to illustrate the leadership process. And let's look at this definition here. Jazz band leaders must choose the music, find the right musicians, and perform in public. But the effect of the performance depends on so many other things: the environment that they're operating in, the volunteers playing in the band, the need for everyone to perform as individuals and as a group, the absolute dependence of the leader on the members of the band, and of course, vice versa, and the need of the leader for the followers to play well. So they identified this as a really good summary of that whole thing. Now, anybody here in this class is a musician of some sort, professional or um, amateur even, and performs in a band or plays with a band. Well, we are looking for a response here, guys. So talk to
No, sir.
me. No musicians?
And my dreams.
No, sir.
Your dreams? All right. How many people participate in a team sport?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Right. So in a team sport, generally there's a leader, like a captain, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And the captain is trying to do what? He's trying to manipulate or motivate his team to perform collectively at their best. But in order to get them to collectively perform at their best, each one has to individually work at their best in the position that they're given. So that that kind of brings to mind what's currently going on with Manchester United, right? You have all these really talented people, and the manager cannot seem to get.
So talk of my side, so now, sir. So talk of my side now, sir.
It's too bad because they're right now a very good example of leadership failing because have all these talented footballers playing in a team, and he can't seem to get the mix right. At least from what I'm listening to, I mean, the last defeat that they had was pretty bad.
Whew,
5-0.
that was heartbreaking, we.
Yeah, I can imagine. But the whole idea is that for some reason you have all this talent, but you can't get them to work together effectively, and that is the function of a leader in a team setting. In the musical setting, the musical director of a band. Now, in a trio or four like this, the leader of the band might be maybe the bassist, might be the leader, one of the trumpeters, or somebody. It doesn't necessarily have to be the person in front. Sometimes I know there's certain bands that I've seen working, and the leader of the band is actually the drummer because they're at the back seeing what everybody's doing, and they kind of keeping the count for everybody to make sure everybody's following the beat and doing their piece on top of it. Each individual is really talented, but as a unit, you can have the best talented people, but if nobody's playing together, then they will all sound bad. Similarly to like what's happening with Manchester, you have all these talented people, but because they're not coordinating efforts and they're not working together as an effective team, then regardless of how talented any individual is on the field, their talent is negated by the ineffectiveness of their ability to work together as a team. And that then falls squarely on the manager because the manager is the person who's responsible for what takes place there, right? Mr. Manchester?
Yes,
whoever
sir,
that.
you are very correct. He's a waste of time manager. He needs to go.
Uh, let's hope that brings a solution. So, because is it that he's going to be removed, or is he being promoted, or given a new
Well,
contract?
well, right now they went silent after the defeat. The management and then went silent, so we still waiting to hear. But more than likely, they're probably gonna sack him.
Well, given that kind of defeat, yeah, maybe.
It's not
All right.
really the fitness; it's the side they lost to.
But that makes that's like salt in the wound. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So that's the metaphor that is talking about here, and this is the jazz metaphor. But you could liken it to football and that kind of stuff to see where um, it is a relationship that has to be developed between the leader in the context that you're operating with the people who are working with you, because everybody brings some skill or some positive to an organization or a situation, and it's up and it's the requirement of the leader to be able to bring out the best in everybody to contribute the most in the team's effort towards getting it in. And that actually is what a lot of organizations, how they look at what what's happening in the leadership aspect here. So this metaphoric definition is one that became very popular because people might be able to see this in their mind's eye much easier than some of the other leadership metaphors that existed there. Then you have the metaphor of episodic affairs. And this really speaks to the fact that leadership is not something that takes place consistently and constantly at all times when somebody's at work or in an environment, whatever environment they're practicing the leadership. Think about it from this position. You're the manager of a office or part of a business. Not all of the activities at all times that you take place or you get involved in are specifically leadership oriented. A lot of the stuff that you're looking at or that you're doing is actually going to be more operational. So you're going to be doing things like, as a manager, for example, you might be doing rostering. You're not practicing any leadership there. You're practicing more organizational skills there. Um, you might be doing budgeting, which is really resource allocation estimations that you're doing. But when you have to talk to an employee or a subordinate in your thing and maybe encourage them, discipline them, or give them some kind of guidance and stuff, that at that point in time you're being specific in your leadership, because there's where your leadership power comes up. But other times you're not going to be dealing with it. So the idea is that leadership doesn't occur routinely. It happens in little moments over time. So 10 minutes here, half an hour there, 15 minutes there. Now and then, like for example, if you're running a meeting in which you are, a staff meeting, for example, that is a leadership activity, because in the meeting you are going to be conducting a number of activities where you're driving forward on some particular idea or concept that you're looking forward to. So that episodic metaphor is one that also is utilized, and it makes a lot of practical sense because you don't operate as a leader at all points in time of your life. I mean, when you go home, you're not going to be leading; you're just going to be dealing with your day-to-day activities as you get home. All right, so let's look at the various theories that have developed over time, and the multiple disciplines or the various disciplines that help to shape the various concepts. The ones that we're going to end up looking at is those that were developed, or those theories of leadership that was developed through social and behavioral sciences. And notice the use of the phrase "F scientists," because at some point in time, psychologists and sociologists began to utilize systematically scientific methodology in trying to gather data to support positions of theories. Now, let's kind of track back a little bit. How does anything or any concept or idea become a theory? Anybody knows that process of how theories are developed, especially in social sciences? Yeah, anybody? How does a theory emerge? Now, most of you are science, social science students, correct? All right, so nobody knows.
Is it from challenging an idea?
All right, well, the process of a particular name is called hypothesis testing. You familiar with that?
Yeah.
All right. So in hypothesis testing, you come up with a hypothesis, correct?
Yeah.
All right, and you set up two positions that the hypothesis is correct or the hypothesis is false, and then you design a test and then conduct the test and gather the data. When you gather the data is either going to support that the theory or the hypothesis, sorry, is true or not. And based upon your findings, then you're going to be able to determine whether or not the theory has value. That makes sense? So far, so good?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the problem is that process of social sciences did not initially begin in the process of generating some of the theories that we're going to be looking at. So, the first assumption that was made was that and again, when you're making theories, you have to make assumptions. So, some of the first or initial theories about leadership was that it was first believed to be a very simple construct. Um, the problem with that is that leadership is not simple. It is a very complicated social phenomenon. And that is one of the reasons why some of the early theories were very simplistic and problematic. And despite how complex it has become, a lot of the theories have been criticized because it is not necessarily getting the data to support the theories that they would like to. So some of the ideas are kind of half formed. But one of the good things about leadership studies is that a lot of them have been done, and a lot have been done by very respectable institutions and organizations. And that brings us to the various types of theories that kind of come up under these classifications here. So you have great man approach, trait theories or trait approach, behavioral approaches, situational contingency approaches, influence theories, reciprocal leadership theories, and chaos theory. So these are some of the what some of the categories under which some of the theories came up under. So if we look at the great man approach, those theories that first started off the whole thinking um, was probably where the whole concept of thinking about leadership from a very simplistic position started. And around that time, the leadership theory of the great man approach was heavily dependent upon Darwinistic theory that dominated the early part of the 19th century. So remember, we're talking about the theories that are being developed coming out of the 1900s. So anybody remembers who Darwin is and what his theory was all about?
Evolution.
Yes, he had the evolutionary thing, and he talked about evolution being due to survival of the fittest, right? So that basically, that Darwinist theory indicated that it takes a great man to be a leader, and great men came from families. So the problem with it is that great men, the great man folklore, as they called it, is based on brothers of reigning kings who were ascribed to have abilities of power and influence. It was believed that the intermarriage of the fittest would produce an aristocratic class superior to the lower class. Now, there was a problem with that because you also had great women. So, great women who emerged in history were simply ignored. You understand? So, if facts or occurrences in history occurred that um, made the theory not look good, then you just simply ignore it, which is non-scientific in nature, of course, we could see. More importantly, we also understand this idea of intermarrying of the fittest in the aristocratic classes or the royalty classes created a big problem, because here it was firmly believed that if you did not have royal blood, then you could not be a leader. That making sense? At least from their perception. And therefore it was the breeding of an individual that determined their fitness for being a leader. Now, of course, we understand what happens with intermarriage within close members of a similar family. That inbreeding causes weaknesses to emerge, and it starts to weaken people's minds. They start having problems with or mental issues that arise over time. So again, the great man theory is kind of based upon folklore, but it was part of the practice, because remember, a lot of the leaders prior to the 1900s coming up were really just families that emerged in societies as kings and queens and prince and princesses and that kind of stuff. And therefore, in order to maintain that, a prince from one region would marry a princess from another region, and that whole thing. If you ever looked at any of those films that looked at the king and queens and of different parts of Europe, you realize that there are a lot of intermarriage taking place between them, where people were married simply because of their lineage. It had nothing to do with whether they how they felt about each other and that kind of stuff. So um, there's a film called Rain, I think, that kind of went through one that kind of sort of tried to do a lot, but a lot of those movies kind of illustrate what took place. Even that film Braveheart talked about part of it as well, loosely based on some of the reality that took place again. Now, the trait approach, on the other hand, kind of came up in the 1900s or the early 1900s, um, where what they were trying to say here is that great leaders or good leaders had a particular set of traits that they were able to elicit, and therefore they tried to observe these traits and give a list of what those traits should be or characteristics. The problem is that the theory was unable to come up with a comprehensive list of what they can accept as being those traits that were necessary. And one of the things you have to remember too is what was happening in the early 1900s was a movement called eugenics was very popular at that point in time. Anybody's familiar with eugenics, guys? And as a precursor to genetics, but eugenics really was a very
That is the book that Hitler read.
one of the books, yes. Eugenics was very closely related to racial purity,
Yeah.
where it was believed that you could breed the perfect people, and that there were certain people in society, because of their eugenics, should not breed. And of course, Jews were one, black people were another, and anybody who wasn't Aryan, white, blonde, blue-eyed was not deemed to be in possession of the traits necessary to become leaders. So eugenics is part of a kind of study there that was closely related with high levels of racism. In fact, it was utilized to um, to justify some of the activities taking place in World War II with Hitler. And if you looked at the history of Mengele, Dr. Mengele, he was one of the persons who were really brought into that whole eugenics, I think, and took his experimentation in the concentration camps to heart, and actually experimented a lot on people um, in that position, in that situation. It was really problematic approach, and believe it or not, some people still believe in eugenics. So
Also, that eugenics theory
Mhm.
is what apparently caused, well, one of the things that fueled Gandhi's transformation when he went back to India,
Yep.
because he spent a lot of time in South Africa
And that's where
during
a
the
lot of
apartheid.
practice. Yes, that's correct. That's
And
correct.
then when he went back home and he observed the caste system and the British and what they were doing,
And how they
that
were
was, a
manipulating it.
fuel there.
Yep.
And
That's
now,
correct.
what I will add to the twist is that I think actually that last class um, is how people observing the same practice of eugenics with a systematically di- dissecting the society using the vaccination card.
Right.
Because that
And
says all of that is part of it.
yeah. In fact, there's the accusation that a lot of the vaccines are designed to wipe out certain elements of society that are deemed to be unworthy of being alive,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, actually, I saw a small TikTok where the guy was also saying, even though the companies purporting that all the vaccines are different, we've got different manufacturers, they
Mhm.
are all the same. When you look at the financiers or the owners of the companies, it's the
Right.
same people own all.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised because Big
So
Pharma,
the same,
Big
yeah.
Pharma has a lot of secrets in terms of the backroom behaviors that take place at the boardroom levels.
Well,
Because
one
in essence,
argument I have,
they're private businesses, huh?
well, I'll say one argument I have when I tell people, I say when you go back to WW2, they
Mhm.
say Hitler was cremated or some kind of thing, so they couldn't find him, right?
Mhm.
But there was a Operation Paperclip where all the Yankees and the British went in and they what do you call this? I wouldn't say kidnapped, but they rescued all the German scientists and they brought them back to Uruguay, Brazil, the
To
USA,
continue,
and they
to
changed the
continue their
names.
work. To continue their work.
Yeah, and they changed the names. And in
Yeah.
changing the names, the conspiracy theorists tell you some of the people now, like Bill Gates, Monsanto, all these people,
Uh,
they are generations of the Nazi heads continuing the
well, I
conspiracy.
don't know. I don't know enough about that paperclip conspiracy, but I've heard about it loosely. But I haven't done any deep dives into that one. But I've looked at the New World Order and the QAnon conspiracy theories, and there are some elements there, but it really does take your mind for a long stretch in some instances when it comes to this New World Order stuff that comes up. All right, so let's hold that for now because there are elements. Why I'm bringing that up is because during the period that the trait theory approaches came up, it was fueled from that thinking of eugenics and that there are specific traits that humans need to have to be considered to be superior, and that was one of the elements that led to. So if you remember the great man theory, that was Darwin's thinking of influencing that great man theory. The traits approach was influenced by the eugenics movement that was taking place because again it was a movement in academic spheres that was kind of driving some of these things. um, so you'd see here that it assumed leaders had particular traits such as a particular type of intelligence, height, self-confidence that differentiated them from non-leaders and thus made them successful. But absolute research failed to produce that list that they were talking about of characteristics that leaders must possess to be effective. So the theory wasn't backed up by the practice and what was actually taking place. People in leadership positions weren't conforming to these traits that they had identified or were trying to identify in in their positioning of this theory or this idea. So that then led to the development of more behavioral approaches. So what they try to do in this one is observe what managers do on the job for management roles and those that were for leadership roles. And this is some of the theories that they basically started to develop from here. Effective and effective leaders. So they started by saying that you either fall into the category of effective or ineffective. And therefore they started to study the difference between the two. Now, basically here, what they would actually be looking at is they'll be doing field studies and observational studies where they will go in with sort of like checklists and kind of say, okay, for the day this person did X, Y, Z, and we'll classify that as a particular type of activity and another one. So here we're talking about the 50s and early 60s. All right. Now this was part and parcel of the industrialization movement. So coming out of World War II, the world kind of had to go into a rebuilding exercise because a lot of the Europe in particular was flattened by the war. And the States was actually where most of production was taking place. So what you found happening is that you had heavy industrialization taking place. And that approach to the studies, they were looking at factories and how factories were run and how they were effective. So it was really kind of industrialized thinking that was going on here. So there were studies done by Ohio State and the University of Michigan, and they produced two particular dimensions of managerial behavior: consideration behavior and initiating structure. So that they explain consideration was described as the degree to which a leader acts in a friendly and supportive manner and shows concerns for their subordinates and their welfare. Whereas initiating structure is the degree to which a leader defines and structures his or her role and the role of subordinates towards the attainment of group and formal goals. So what you're really talking about there is that you have two sets of behaviors that they're looking at. Those behaviors that were going to be developing the relationship aspect of the leadership role or the leadership relationship, and those that were geared towards achieving the goals of the organization. So you had two supposedly, in some instances, dichotomies. So the two dimensions are independent of each other. So scores can vary between each in either a positive or negative manner. So basically, what they used to do is that they would go into those factories and basically look at what the manager is doing and check it off as okay. It was. Let me go back to the terms here. The terms that they were consideration behavior or initiating structure behavior. So they would start checking off this behavior is that behavior is this, or they'll take note of aberrations and that kind of stuff and try to look at what was going on in relation to that. So we'd see how that would work out. So what ended up happening was, well, another study, this one here, they broke it down into another set of things: concern for people and concern for production. So it's the same thing, just different names, right? So the model was then concluded that effective managers would show high concern for people and production. So that kind of makes sense. It kind of simplistic in its thinking that managers who work well with people can get people to, become concerned for the output of the company and production. So again, remember, you're talking about factory settings and a lot of instances. And factories weren't really designed in the early 50s and 60s that they weren't human friendly. They were more friendly towards the machinery and the equipment and the output. So if a manager tried to be more humanistic in his approach, which is concern for people, and he was able to combine that with good relationships, with concern for production, he might have been able to raise the production of the thing. So that's where their research concluded that then you needed to have high concern for both people and production to get to be good. Now, the Michigan studies included three different things: identification of relationship, leader behavior, group processes, and measures of group performance. Came up with three different things: task-oriented behavior, relationship-oriented behavior, and participative leadership behaviors. So they started to look now not at the two what you might call in statistics we have a special name when you have two factors. I think it's called bivariable analysis. This one was a little more complicated because now you're bringing in three particular activities that they're looking at and making correlation studies with it. So this was going to be a little more difficult to be doing the observations as opposed to bivariate analysis. Here they were looking at three different variables that they were looking at in terms of the behaviors and actions of leaders. Now, the biggest problem with this is that the approaches were very simplistic. So again, and they weren't. And another thing, besides being simplistic in their nature and sort of breaking things down as to these steps are what you need to take, they also weren't taking into consideration the context or the situation that the management was or the leadership was taking place. And therefore, at the end of the day, you see this statement here, the results proved to be inconclusive and inconsistent because they weren't seeing the same behaviors, first of all, leading to the same outcomes. So in some instances, you had people behaving and outcomes being different, but different activities taking place. So they weren't seeing the kind of correlation that they were looking for either of those models. So though they conducted a lot of research, it meant that at the end of the day, the theory really wasn't holding water. So although it was written about, and if you read any of those old textbooks, they're really technical and a lot of mathematics involved with it. And that's because they were using all the statistical approaches. Kind of went overboard with the statistical approach there. So, but at the end of the day, the concepts are very, well, as I said, inconsistent and inconclusive. So, but again, here you're talking about that industrialization period where there was the rebuilding of countries taking place, and therefore there's a heavy emphasis on factory and output. All right. So that then leads us to the situational contingency approach. And that situational contingency started to bring up the idea that the context in which the leadership was taking place was going to be part of the issues. Additionally, the situation will also bring to bear on the nature of how leadership is going to be looking at. So, in essence, what they're saying here, the situation determines who will emerge as the leader, and the leader will be the leader being the product of the situation. So it's sort of like for those of you who come from that social and psychological background, a bit of the what's the term? Um, Nurture versus nature concept comes up in this particular thing here. Is the leader behaving this way because they were born with these innate type of qualities or traits or behaviors, as opposed to how much is the environment shaping the behavior? So they had a lot of arguments coming up for that. So the research, therefore, was looking at how do the effects of leadership vary from situations. So here now they're trying to take into consideration how situations impact, and therefore contingency theory is basically making contingencies for the situation that the leader is acting in or leadership is behaving in. And that, therefore, this is why they say here situational theories emphasize that leadership behavior cannot be explained in a vacuum. Elements of the situation must be included. So the context of the leadership is what was also brought to bear. So again, now they're saying you have another variable that you have to be looking at, which is the situation or the context in which the activity is taking place. And two situational theories came up. You had the least preferred co-worker, LPC model, developed in the mid-60s, which described how the situation moderates the relationship between leader traits and effectiveness. So now they're saying, okay, so a leader comes in with these particular traits and skills, and the situation will impact upon his effectiveness or her. Well, in a lot of cases, there was only him because there were only male oriented leadership in this particular organizational studies. So the second one was the path goal theory, which is 1957 Giorgio Populis here. He posits that if a group member perceives high productivity to be an easy path to attaining their personal goals, then they will tend to be a high producer. But if personal goals are obtainable in other ways, then they will not likely be a high producer. So path goal theory is saying the objective of the person is to fulfill their own personal goals. And if high productivity leads to them getting to that goal, then they will be highly productive. But if their own personal objectives is how they're going to access that, then they're likely to not have high productivity, but they'll tend to be more. So it came to bear, therefore, that the leader's responsibility was to increase the personal rewards to subordinates for performance in order to make the path to their goal clearer and easier, but also primarily that they will be high producers. So this is sort of like the beginning elements of motivational theory thinking, because what you're going to be doing is you're going to motivate people to be better performers by indicating or suggesting to them that if you do it this way, your personal goals and objectives will be quickly recognized, as opposed to if you try to do other things. That making sense? Of course, problem with that is lack of supporting data. So trying to measure that particular thing, again, with measuring human behavior, you're going to find that the observational approach had lots of limitations when it came to this, and so therefore, again, inconclusive data and inconsistent situations came across the whole thing with contingency theory, situational contingency theories. All right. So now we have influence theories, and this one here brings up another guy from. He started in 1924, and then right at the end of the war, because they had to take a break during the war, um, during the Second War, about all this stuff. So Max Weber um, looked at charisma in the management context to describe a form of influence based not on traditional power or formal authority, but rather on what followers' perception of that leader is endowed with exceptional qualities. Now, this is where now anybody's familiar with Max Weber, or Max Weber, as some people call him. Very famous guy. He's actually positioned in a lot of early management texts, credited with a lot of ideas coming up from that. No? Nobody is familiar with Max Weber?
No, sir.
No?
No, sir.
Any management students here? There are no management students here?
I passed through that theory, but I don't come that to the archives already.
All right. So Weber was actually one of those guys who did the XY theory of leadership. That sounds more familiar. X and Y theories. No? All right. Well, left it alone. But Max Weber was a German guy, and he was also under the influence of that eugenics movement to us. So one of the things you have to look at. But what he was looking at, remember, one of the problems or one of the situations that came up was the problem in Germany was led by the charismatic leadership of Hitler. So he was, of course, preordained or kind of influenced into looking at the impact of charisma on the theory. So therefore, here you're talking about puppet master type of behavior that they're looking at there. Now, charismatic leadership didn't stop with him. It also went on to, because in the 70s, you remember you had Jim Jones, and you had the Moonies, and you had other cult followings that started to develop. And he started to look at the formal theory of charismatic leadership that would be explained by a set of testable variables. That's what Robert House was proposing. And the problem with charisma is that the leader is given values based upon the perception of followers. And that is kind of a dangerous thing, because it may not be accurate, because the situation, the event is taking place in part of the whole process. So one of the things that I think they talked about here was several theories existed and posited that there are conditions that facilitate charismatic leaders. And that had to do with if you are in times of crisis and when followers are willing to challenge the status quo. So that means that charismatic leaders can be more effective during periods when there's perceived crisis in the country, such as wartime, such as now during this pandemic, and where people are willing to challenge the existing status quo. So let's think about the Black Lives Movement and the whole movement to defund the police. You're all are following that whole thing, right? So it's obviously a crisis issue because, or perceived crisis issue, and therefore the area is ripe for some charismatic leader to rise in the current circumstances because they will be able to capitalize upon the general feeling of we're in crisis, and obviously what was happening in the past is not working, so it's time to make change, and change means challenging whatever took place before the status quo. So that issue of the defunding the police is one of those concepts that has come up with. It hasn't found a overall champion, but there is a huge movement in that area associated with the Black Lives Matter movement as well. But of course, it's very polarizing because you have a whole host of people who are fighting back with all lives matter, and defunding the police is a huge mistake, that kind of stuff. So it's going to be interesting to see in the next couple of years how those movements either develop or fizzle out as things move forward. Because really and truly, what their focus is on the United States, but but in essence, most of the world suffers from institutionalized racism. Um, and the way in which institutions have been set up predisposed some elements of our society access in like in West Indian society or Caribbean experience. It has to do with people's wealth and level in status, whereas in other countries it might be just simply their race and color and background, that type of stuff. um, but a lot of it has to do with your economic status as well. So you have various forms of institutionalized discrimination that's taking place in our societies that this can lead themselves into some charismatic leader rising. Now, again, we talked about the danger of charismatic leaders in the past, and I think the problem is that our past experience with charismatic people has been, it's sort of like a mixed bag. Sometimes you get people who, because some people believe that Trump, for example, is a very, so he was, he's not dead yet, um, is a charismatic individual. He's charismatic to his base. And the problem with that is if he can gather as much support as he did the last time, he is likely to be a dangerous individual who can mislead an entire nation, as we saw in his stint as prime president of the United States. I mean, that was a disaster just waiting to happen there, because every Monday morning was some nonsense happening there. All right, and therein lies the problem with charismatic leadership, because you can have somebody who says what everybody wants to hear and gets everybody's support, and then what happens? All right, so that moves us to now reciprocal leadership theories. This is coming more in the area of our period. Well, actually, our period, the studies that we're looking at, and the reciprocal leadership theories came up in the 1970s. Now, anybody knows what was happening in the world in the 1970s? What's the context of the 70s?
Hippies.
Sorry?
Hippies.
Hippies. So what is the hippie movement about?
No war in oh God.
Right. So there was an anti-war
Vietnam.
movement. Right. Good. What else? There's a whole host of things that's happening in the 70s. Started in the late 60s into the 70s. Music had a lot to do with it. The Vietnam War had to do with it, some of it too. You all ever heard the term flower power?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course you had the drugs. So think about the context of the major thinkers existing in a period during where you had this one love movement and love will conquer all and make love not war, that kind of thing, boosted by drugs, rock and roll, anti-war, anti-Vietnam, that kind of stuff. So you have to think of the context and where these theories are coming from. All right. So these theories emerged that focus on the relationship between leaders and followers and their interactions with each other. Because now they're starting to say that leaders can't do anything if they don't have followers. Because here you're talking about people who are now a little more critical thinking. They're not the sheep that was expected in the past, because that's what was expected in the past with the great man theory and the traits approach and the industrial type management theories. What the leader says you do, that's basically it. Here you have more free thinking taking place here. And it meant that leaders had to move from a more motivational position and try and provide an mutual objectives so that both followers and leaders can move towards accomplishing that goal. So it wasn't that the leader had a position and you followed and did what they said. The leader was then responsible for developing a following in that thing. Now, of course, being charismatic could help in that light. So there's some elements with that too. Okay, so leadership is not just something that a leader does to followers, but rather leadership is a process that meaningfully engages leaders and participants, values the contribution of those participants, shares the power that the leader has and the authority, and then establishes the leaders as being inclusive and interdependent. And that is along the lines of what we're looking at, moving the study that we're going to be looking at here, which is called the RLM model, relational leadership model. So you'd see that the origins of the theory is from the 1970s period that we're looking at here. So it's beginning to look at the relationship aspect of the leader with the followers. And of course, that then brings us to the different types of models that it involved here. So we could quickly move through here. So you had three major ones: the transforming leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. The one that we're going to spend more time on is the servant leadership. But there's a chapter that you guys are going to do from the draft. Let's check it and see. The leading change will treat with that. That's transformational leadership. Power and influence will look at the various forms in more detail. So you'd see the servant leadership come up there. And right, the others are going to deal with the ethics and the team values and stuff like that. So these last two chapters here, leading change and power and influence, is going to focus its attention on some of these theories here. Definitely the servant leadership model, and the followership is going to be brought together in the whole concept. And we're going to see how these theories were utilized and how more generally accepted they are. So transformational leadership or transforming leadership theory, formulated by James McGregor, defines leadership as a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So it's a reciprocal relationship. The follower does things to achieve the goals and to motivate the leader, and the leader does things for the followers to do, and so on. That sort of backward and forward thing. So again, it focuses heavily on the relationship that is developed between those individuals. So leaders appeal to followers higher ideals and moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, humanitarianism, not to lesser emotions such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hate. Now that's what we would hope, that our leaders will capitalize upon those higher ideals. A lot of leaders, though, use the emotions of fear, greed, and jealousy and hatred to motivate their things. And again, a good example of that is the way in which Trump emerged as the president, he was able to capitalize upon the obvious social change that was taking place in the American society and use the fear of that change along with his greed and their hatred of that change and the people who they perceived as their enemies, to be able to arrive at a position of power. Remember, he talked all the things about draining the swamp and um, getting the Mexicans to pay for the wall and all kind of rubbish. That kind of stuff was, feeding on the fears of the nation and those people in those areas that would generally support that concept and those ideas. And you still have some serious fallout taking place as a result of that, because leadership or leaders that are built upon fear and those other types of emotions leads to a different quality or type of leadership, as opposed to how Obama came into power by appealing to people higher ideals of, you know, being the change that you want to be, equality, being more human, being more fair, and that type of stuff. Those kind of things is what he had positioned and sold to his transformational leadership. So again, you have that situation where you have leaders behaving in that particular manner going across the board. So those are things that you wanna and it, of course, this assumption here that the leadership is inseparable from the followership, because then in essence they are both two sides of the same coin, and that is true. So if the leader that we have embodies fear and greed and hatred, then the followers are going to be the same. They're going to be related to each other. Similarly, when you have a leader who's based upon fairness and equity and that type of stuff, then the followers around that person are going to reflect those types of things. So that's the thinking that the relational theories, and this one actually spoke more to what they were seeing happening at that period of time. So um, you had Charles Manson, for example. You're familiar with Charles Manson?
Yeah.
Some people, not Marilyn Manson, but Charles Manson. Um, he drew a group of individuals around him who he was able to manipulate and based on fear of him, and that he had a very uncanny way. He was very charismatic as well. That's another element I would look at. And he had an uncanny way of being able to make people do things they wanted, that he wanted them to do. And that element is part of the whole situation that was taking place. But his ideals were based upon some very skewed concepts and ideas. I mean, to this up to when he died, you know, he failed to acknowledge that he was responsible for some of the activities that took place, that he was so-called put in jail for, committed for. That's a case that you all could look at, in terms of how he rose to where he was, and there's some parallels between him and Jim Jones in terms of their development. I've been kind of doing some research in those guys, just to fill in some of the gaps that exist. Um, so again, so these are the assumptions they're using. Power is used to realize common goals and purposes, not for purposes of exploitation or manipulation. Again, that is the altruistic nature of what the theory is trying to say. That, and you have to remember, this is during that flower power period where people were looking for, we have to become, equality, lovers, not warmongers, and we have to look out for the well-being of everybody, and we're all everybody's brothers and my brother's keeper and that kind of stuff. So really important element here is the moral component, that everybody had to hold each other up to higher levels of moral standards and ethical values. That's very important part, because that actually is a very critical part of the transformational leadership models that we're going to be looking at, and quite an important element that we look at. And these guys have been identified as transformational leaders who use that type of technique, either knowingly or unknowingly. You all recognize all of them, right? Anybody not recognizing any images here?
The bottom middle one.
Bottom middle one, this guy here.
Yeah.
Anybody wants to help him? I used them previously in the previous Roosevelt. Right. Okay. This guy here, everybody recognizes him, right? Abraham Lincoln. What transition did he go through? What transition did he work on or was related?
The U.S. Constitution.
In what area?
Maybe what area?
Well, it's specifically one area that he worked on.
After the Civil War.
No. Well, he led the Civil War.
Slavery.
Yes, he abolished slavery. That was the main thing he had gotten involved with. Mahatma Gandhi is in relation to the independence of India and that movement, and of course there were problems with that. JFK is another one. He was the transformational leader in the United States that tried to move the country away from very self-centered approaches to doing things to more altruistic. And of course, Martin Luther King, that was the civil rights movement. And of course, this lady down here, this is Mother Teresa. Somebody made because I was going through this last night with another group of students, and somebody made an interesting comment. Of the 6 people here, 4 of them were assassinated. And they were assassinated because they were transforming nations in which some people did not like the transformation that was taking place, and they were taken out because of their efforts to transform nations or transform countries and thinking. And as a result, that is one of the problems or the repercussions of making that kind of major transformational change in societies that have ingrained behaviorals from or entrenched ideologies. That's a problem that we face. Mother Teresa and Teddy Roosevelt here, they didn't have to worry about that because their transitions were more. He transitioned the United States out of economic recession, the Great Recession or the Great Depression, into a more prosperous period. And Mother Teresa is about transforming our lives away from materialism into altruism, and that's a more universal approach to things. But these guys, they were operating in political and social political areas, and it was something that they all paid the ultimate price for in trying to make those transformations, which is why they stand out in history, because they stood for or represented something better, a life that was better, that we aspired towards. Unfortunately, not everybody agrees with their transformation, and that's the way some people treated it as well. Transformational leadership is contrasted with transactional leadership, which is leadership that is built upon the transactions between the leader and the participant. So basically what you're talking about there in transactional is sort of like motivational theory. So it's an extrinsic stimulus to be able to get people to do things. Sort of like the carrot on a stick, or the carrot or the stick. Basically, you either get a reward or you get punishment. That kind of transactional deal that we're looking at, and therefore, transformational leadership will be compared to transactional to demonstrate the change in the relationship between leaders and followers in that particular dimension. All right. The theory goes on to say that leaders can engage in both transformational and transactional because, again, the theory begins to say to us that there is uh, there's a combination that you could work with. You don't necessarily have to use only one style, but you can use a combination of these things to get and achieve your goals. So, of course, critics of the theory focus on its overall lack of clarity and specificity. So, the theory requires more clarification, and the specifics of how that relationship is the element of the haziness that they're talking about. How do you go about developing those high ideals, and what specifics do you go into it? So that's, of course, one of the elements that they talk about having problems with. So you notice the date and time of this, and this is 1994 and 2004. So more modern thinking along there. Servant leadership theory is one of the more popular ones. This positions the leader as the servant to the followers. So um, this lady, Kamala Bissessor, actually focused her term of office when she was in power, utilizing this. I don't know if you all remember the sort of mantra she used to use when she was talking about service, service, service. That was the function of the government, and to a great extent, that is what good leadership is supposed to do. It's supposed to be there to serve the needs and wants of the society. So, from a political sphere, this was good. So, the servant, through focusing on the primary needs of the others and the organization, transforms him or herself into a leader. So, basically, servant leadership is designed to make everybody, to empower everybody to become leaders themselves, leaders in their little spheres, and basically empowering people to become the what's the word I want to use, the to be able to take charge of their circumstances and move things forward. So so play a significant role in holding their institutions in trust for greater good of society, which is the reciprocal nature of leadership process. So here you're talking about making sure that the company is doing what it can to make sure that it benefits all of its constituents or its shareholders or its stakeholders, and making sure that it is serving the society that it operates in, and not just extracting from this. So this is kind of novel too, because in a lot of instances, especially when we talk about organizations, when they come to particular countries, what they end up doing is they are very parasitic in nature. So here you're talking about multinational corporations. When they move into different countries, their objectives of achieving the maximum profit generally have a negative impact upon the country that they're dealing with. So if you think about Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, even African countries, where European multinational corporations went into those places, they did not leave those places better off. In fact, they created situations in which it made their the people who live there made their situations worse off. So you had to look at this servant leadership model as reversing that and saying, no, no, no. You're going in there, yes, you want to achieve these goals and objectives for the company, but you have to make sure that all the other elements of your society, this is where social responsibility and corporate responsibility comes to play. You need to be making sure that the nature of your leadership leaves everybody better off in the long run, rather than just extracting what you can for your own personal profits or the profits of the company to the expense of everybody else. So again, this is difficult for some people. Um, Another term that was utilized to refer to this is stewardship. So you had, again, the group that's going to do this is going to do this in much more detail when they look at stewardship and they look at the servant leadership, because they're considered various levels of this type of theory, moving to higher and higher levels. that's going on with it. So we can move through this one pretty quickly because it really is just speaking to that servant leadership role. The at the end, what it is the leader serves the followers, and the followers are empowered to become independent and themselves become leaders at the end of the day. So the followership theory is the last one here that we're looking at in this batch. It's redefining followership and leadership and rejects that industrial mode that was developed in the early 50s and 60s. So again, it focuses its attention more on the followers than the role of the leaders, and therefore the in the past the leader was seen as the most critical and important thing. To the to In this model, what they're saying is that leaders are important, but followers are just as important, and therefore they require as much attention in the theory as um, as the leader himself, because it's not the whole sheep mentality that they're looking at, but empowered individuals who are contributing to the development of the thing. So we talked about this. We had the alienated followers, sheep, yes, people, survivors, and effective followers. We talked about this. I showed the model in the previous thing that we're looking at. So effective followers share the quality of that their ability to manage themselves. They're committed to the organization, to the purpose, principles. I mean, think about your if any of you all are members of any organizations or community groups and stuff like that. Think about these followership things, and you don't necessarily have a management position, but what do these describe your behaviors or your qualities in that organization? Um, they are designed to be effective in that sense. So again, it speaks to that reciprocal nature between the leader and the follower, and of course they are working together to achieve this commonality, these common goals. So again, they're speaking about to be effective, you have to have certain qualities that challenge or can challenge leaders with questionable motivations, which is something that you like. Effective leaders need to be empowered, honored for their contribution, and valued for the satisfaction and pride that they take in their roles of helping the organization achieve its goals and vision, which could also and should also include whistleblowing, because that's one of the elements that they talk about there. So leadership in the early 20th century used that, that's what I talked about before, the industrial paradigm or that thing, and therefore they have a tendency to be um, another it's kind of like a return back to that industrial paradigm that they were looking at before, because now we're talking about emerging leadership paradigms. um, Leadership theory so this is straightforward here. It's really making a comparison of the sort of movement from the structural theories, from the thing to the management oriented, so you focus only on the manager, then on the leader, then you start to look at, of course, male oriented. That's another aspect of leadership paradigm that has shifted over time. Um, Materialistic, those are the technocratic, linear, quantitative, specific, and language. This quotation here really speaks to how the thinking is in terms of the nature or the underlying assumptions that are being made in the 20th century theory development that they talked about. So what they're going to be looking at is that in the new paradigms, what we have to be looking for is a reciprocal leadership theory that allows the experience paradigm shift from that industrial era to post-industrial. So it's integrated, that it has to be more open and wider in its focus, and open to different ways of thinking about things. Um, this quotation here from Slocum and Lutham, faced faced with an unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and moral ethical tumultuous sea of change, there is a need for new theories, new applications, and just plain new way of thinking about leadership. And that's the nature of our current situation. We are in this kind of period, and it means that we have to be looking at trying to find a new way of dealing with leadership. And that's important because the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different result. And that's something that we really do have to pay attention to. So the reality of that is a lot of what has been taught about management studies and leadership studies are actually based upon a lot of those old conventions. And unfortunately, it therefore means that a lot of us who have come through the education system based upon historically inept models are not ready for the new world that faces us. And that brings us into the last set of theories, which actually speaks to chaos theory. The world is not this, as you can see here, it says the world may not be an orderly place. And that's the reality of the situation. The world is a messy place. And therefore, those neat little theories that we may be talking about in classroom spaces can't fit into the reality that faces us. I don't know if you all believe that or can see that yourselves. A lot of the theories that we look at now, or that may have been positioned or propositioned in management studies and leadership studies, they don't describe the reality of the chaotic world that we face at this point in time. Right, so here we start to talk about the chaos elements that we talk about. To successfully navigate in this world, we have to approach things in a new way. And this requires that we are able to deal with change. And change is probably the most constant thing and the most the only constant in life is change, if we think about that from that perspective. So this is where the management leadership theory start to look at chaos and chaos theory. So again, anybody ever remember that book on chaos theory that came up? Everybody remembers that thing about chaotic behavior, chaos theory, about a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, causing a hurricane um, across the world in Asia. Anybody ever remember hearing about that chaos theory? No? People lost already and not hearing a peep from anybody.
That's why I never heard of that.
We know love.
Huh?
Never heard of that.
You never heard about chaos theory. All right. All right. Well, would you agree that our world is not the ideal place that we expect things to be? I mean, how many of you all have some degree of OCD? That you have to work in an orderly fashion. You have to have things arranged around you in a manner that is not chaotic and cluttered. How do you all feel operating in places like that, when the place is just kind of hodgepodge of all kind of nonsense around you? Anybody? Okay, I need to look at you all of this. We just have a few more slides. Some of it is because the last theory we're looking at is chaos theory, and then
See, well, you know my environment, I have no real control over that.
right, but that's what I'm saying.
But the thing is, in my position now, what I try to tell my subordinates is keep your environment clean.
Yeah,
Right?
but
So that if I go to like where my workspace is,
uh,
I would sanitize the place, wipe it down.
right. Well, I'm not talking about that element. Although that is part of it.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is, where things are placed and how they're
Yeah, you
arranged.
know what? I was getting to that, right? Because like someone like if I go like the chef before me, they
Yeah.
will drink coffee or whatever, and just leave everything all over the place, all
Uh-huh.
over the desk. I might be looking for a particular book, and that book might be on top of the fridge, and all kind of madness.
Right.
So when I go there now, I just had to go and get all the books, put it in an order, updated, neat them the place now. But I wouldn't say OCD. I
Right.
would say OCD, but
But it needs
I
you
understand what you're
want
saying.
you want some form of order.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Now, the problem that we face from when we start to look at this theories of management and leadership, what we're saying is that the theories are developed with the idea that the world is a definable, simple place. But the reality is that it's not. It, the world is a chaotic environment, and therefore theories that try to deal with the real world application have to take into consideration that issue of the chaotic nature that we're finding. And that's why chaos theory came up as being one of the popular theories coming in the later part of the 80s and 90s. Um, the model that we're going to look at, and that I'm going to end looking at the presentation at this point because it's coming up on half eight, so we want to wrap it up. And next week we'll look at chapter 3. I'd like you all to look at chapter 3. It's a lot longer in terms of its content because I brought more details in. But that chapter is going to start to outline the relational leadership theory that we're going to be looking at, the model that we're going to be looking at. And that model, I shouldn't say it's a theory, it's a model that's going to pull ideas and concepts from all the other theories, which is why this second chapter really looked at the evolution of leadership thought from its from its early inception from the 1300s. Because if you look at that, this is basically a history lesson on where management and leadership studies have come from. Now, the last model or the last part of the model that I didn't bring up to you guys really, or the last thing was something called authentic leadership. And authentic leadership is really, let me see if we give you a gist of it. Right, authentic leadership positions the individuals at the center of the organizational structure. Now, I remember one of the organizational charts that the college had drawn up about its operations and its leadership model was, and I remember because I did, just want to show you all this. When we did leadership studies, I did this is something called a talking stick, and we got these sticks when we did the 7 habits of highly effective people. And at the time I did these studies, that's when Stephen Covey died in a bicycling accident.
Sir,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but I have to leave now. Is that okay?
yeah, that's fine. You could always look at
Okay.
the
Thank
recording.
you.
Catch up on the end. All right. So when authentic leadership positions the core activity of the organization at the center, and all other activities are around that center. And I remember the diagram we drew, we placed students at the center. And there was this other guy in the class who kept on arguing with us and said, that is not our client, but he's a marketing person. And he kept on saying that our client is the firms and organizations that use our graduates. But we argued with him that from the position, because he was arguing that from the position of being effective for the marketplace. So he was market oriented. I said, okay, well that might be true, that these are the people who use our graduates. But at the end of the day, all of our functions and operations impact directly upon the users of our service. And therefore, the users of our service has to be at our core. So that has to be the center. And that's what authentic leadership tries to do. Authentic leadership positions not the leader at the center of the concerns of the organization, but the followers and clients of the organization. So the leaders on the peripheral. And the objective of authentic leadership is to empower the middle to rise and become empowered and proactive on their own sense, which is something that the college has been trying to do. You can actually probably view that by looking at our mission and vision statement, which again, one group is going to be looking at vision and mission statements by looking at strategic. When they look at the chapter on strategic vision and strategic direction, which is really about strategic management. So for those of you who are doing those chapters, you start to see the connections now backwards with where the entire model is going to. So you all are going to be doing pullouts of various pieces. All right, so let me wrap it up by asking whether or not people have any questions they want to ask at this point. Clarification or just about not necessarily the content that we looked at today, but also, what you need to be doing in the future. Any ideas on how the first group is looking at doing their chapters? Have you finished, especially chapter 4 and 5, which is the first set? Have you all finished reading your chapters?
No.
Did you find the audio versions of them on YouTube?
No.
All right, so I would suggest that maybe I will present chapter 3. Don't worry to go and read it or look at the thing. Try and focus your attention on reading the chapters, please, and then working out a strategy of how you're going to go about presenting the information within an hour's time frame. Okay.
So we have 3 color hours, sir.
At least, well, no. Let me put it to you. Some chapters are going to be shorter, and some chapters are going to be long. The earlier chapters tend to be shorter. So like 45 minutes to an hour max.
We're gonna present for 45 minutes.
Trust
Now
me.
I know wondering.
When you look at the content of your chapter, you will understand it. Remember, you can't leave anything out.
Alright, no problem.
Present everything.
Okay, sir.
Right? This is not it's not a synopsis. You have to give us complete explanation of all the major concepts in the meeting, so all content. So one of the things I'm going to be looking at while you are presenting is that I'm going to be looking at all of the elements of the chapter that you are presenting and explaining. All right? That's important. So get cracking on reading your chapters, because you have to read those chapters more than once to be able to get to the point where you regularly practice on this. Don't wait till the last minute, guys. Be proactive, because again, you're teaching the class the content. That's what you need to do. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Yes? No? Maybe?
No, sir.
All right, Joel. See, we lost some people along the way. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording now. And